Every textbook on Earth agreed on the same fact for decades. This fish went extinct roughly 66 million years ago, in the same catastrophic event that wiped out every non-bird dinosaur on the planet. It appears clearly and repeatedly in the fossil record for hundreds of millions of years, and then it simply stops, vanishing from the rock layers at the exact same boundary that closes out the age of dinosaurs for good. Every paleontologist who ever studied it treated that disappearance as settled fact, printed in encyclopedias and taught in classrooms without a hint of doubt. Then, on the deck of a fishing trawler off the coast of South Africa, a museum curator picked a strange blue fish out of a pile of sharks and starfish, and the fact every textbook agreed on turned out to be wrong. Start with why extinction seemed like the only possible answer for so long, an answer no scientist had any real reason to doubt. This fish, known as the Coelacanth, first shows up in the fossil record roughly 400 million years ago during the Devonian period, long before dinosaurs existed in any form, and long before most other vertebrate lineages had even appeared. For the next several hundred million years, Coelacanth fossils turn up steadily across the world, evidence of a genuinely successful widespread lineage of lobe-finned fish built around thick, limb-like fins, unlike anything found on a typical fish, closely related to the ancient lineage that eventually produced every land-dwelling vertebrate on Earth. Then, right around 66 million years ago, at the boundary marking the mass extinction that ended the Cretaceous period and closed out the age of dinosaurs, Coelacanth fossils disappear completely, and nothing younger than that boundary has ever been found anywhere on the planet, despite more than a century of dedicated fossil hunting. To every scientist working only with the physical evidence available, that pattern had exactly one reasonable explanation. The Coelacanth died out alongside the dinosaurs, a casualty of the same asteroid impact and the ecological collapse that followed it. On December 22, 1938, a 32-year-old museum curator named Marjorie Courtenay Latimer took a taxi to the docks at East London, a port on South Africa's eastern coast, to sort through the latest catch from a trawler called the Nerine. She had asked its captain, Hendrik Goosen, to set aside anything unusual he pulled up during his runs, a standing arrangement between the two of them that had already brought her plenty of interesting specimens over the years. And on this trip, he had something waiting for her unlike anything either of them had seen before. Picking through sharks, starfish, and seaweed piled on the deck, Courtenay Latimer uncovered a heavy steel blue fish, nearly 5 feet long, covered in hard, armor-like scales, with thick fins that moved more like limbs than fins, and an odd, puppy-like tail trailing behind it. She had never seen anything resembling it in all her years running the museum and had no way to identify it herself using anything in her own collection. She sketched the fish carefully and wrote to ichthyologist J.L.B. Smith, a colleague she had worked with before and trusted to know what she was looking at, but Smith was away on holiday and the letter went unanswered. By December 27th, 5 days later, the fish had begun decaying and oozing oil in the summer heat, and with still no word from Smith, Courtenay Latimer reluctantly had it skinned, gutted, and mounted by a taxidermist, a decision that destroyed the internal organs before anyone with the expertise to recognize their scientific significance ever got the chance to examine them. Smith finally saw the mounted specimen in person on February 16, 1939, nearly 2 months after the fish was first hauled aboard. He recognized it immediately, later describing the feeling as though he were looking at a creature that had climbed straight out of 200-million-year-old rock and started swimming again. Smith published his findings in the journal Nature the following month, naming the fish Latimeria chalumnae, the genus honoring Courtenay Latimer directly, and the species honoring the Chalumna River near where the trawler had been working that week. A lineage the fossil record insisted had ended alongside the dinosaurs had, it turned out, simply kept swimming for another 66 million years without anyone noticing. If you're learning something new, be sure to subscribe. For the next 14 years, that single-mounted, gutted specimen was the only Coelacanth known to science anywhere on Earth. Its missing organs, a permanent gap in what researchers could actually study about the living animal, a loss that frustrated scientists for over a decade before anyone got a second chance. A second individual wasn't caught until 1952, this time near the Comoro Islands, off the coast of Mozambique and Madagascar, which turned out to sit much closer to the species' actual population center than the waters of East London ever had. Coelacanths, researchers eventually learned, spend their days sheltering in volcanic caves hundreds of meters underwater around the Comoros, only becoming active as they drift and hunt after dark, a nocturnal, deep-water lifestyle that helps explain why the species stayed hidden from science for so long in the first place. For nearly 60 years afterward, every scientist studying the species operated under the same working assumption. There was exactly one coelacanth population on the planet, confined entirely to the waters around a single small island chain in the western Indian Ocean, with no reason to expect the species existed anywhere else at all. That assumption held until September of 1997, when marine biologist Mark Erdman, on his honeymoon in Indonesia, stepped out of a taxi at a fish market in Manado, on the island of Sulawesi, and spotted a strange, unsavory-looking brown fish being wheeled past on a cart by an elderly vendor. Erdman recognized the four fleshy, limb-like fins immediately, but something was wrong. Every coelacanth ever documented, going back to 1938, had been a deep steel blue. This one was brown. He photographed it before it could be sold and eaten, and the images eventually reached other researchers who confirmed exactly what Erdman had suspected. This was a coelacanth, but not the same population science already knew about. A second live specimen, caught the following year by a local fisherman and brought directly to Erdman, survived for roughly 6 hours before dying, just long enough for scientists to document its coloration, fin movement, and behavior in detail for the very first time, giving them their first real look at a population living more than 10,000 kilometers from the Comoros, in an entirely separate ocean basin altogether. Genetic testing on mitochondrial DNA confirmed the two populations were distinct enough, roughly 4% divergent, to be classified as separate species, formally named Latimeria menadoensis in 1999. A fish already famous for surviving 66 million years longer than it was supposed to, had also been quietly living in an entire second location, on the opposite side of an ocean, that nobody had ever thought to check. The coelacanth's real scientific fame had never actually rested on simply being alive nearly 70 million years past its supposed extinction date. It rested on a far more specific claim, that among every fish alive today, the coelacanth was the single closest living relative to tetrapods, the four-limbed animals, including humans, that descended from fish, which first crawled out of the water and onto land hundreds of millions of years ago. Those thick, limb-like fins, moving in an alternating pattern eerily similar to a walking gait, seemed to make the case almost on their own, without needing much additional evidence. For decades after 1938, that assumption sat at the very center of why paleontologists cared about the species at all, repeated in documentaries and textbooks as an established fact, rather than a hypothesis still waiting to be properly tested. In 2013, a team led by geneticist Chris Amemiya finally sequenced the complete coelacanth genome and published the results in the journal Nature, directly testing that decades-old assumption against real genetic evidence for the first time in the species' history, using tissue samples that had taken years to properly collect from a critically endangered animal nobody wanted to harm just to study it. The result overturned it. Comparing 251 carefully selected genes across the coelacanth, a separate group of fish called Lungfish, and a wide range of tetrapod species, the team found that Lungfish, not the coelacanth, are genetically the closest living relatives to every four-limbed land animal on Earth, humans included. The fish famous for supposedly representing the evolutionary bridge between water and land turned out to be one step further removed from that bridge than its own reputation had claimed for 3/4 of a century. The same genome held a second surprise sitting right alongside the first. Coelacanth protein-coding genes were evolving significantly more slowly than those of both lungfish and tetrapods. Genetic confirmation that the label living fossil wasn't simply a nickname earned by looking unchanged in old photographs and museum mounts. The animal's DNA really was changing at an unusually slow pace, measurably so even by the standards of a fish already famous across the scientific world for barely changing at all since the age of dinosaurs. Subscribe to not miss the next one. The most recent correction to the Coelacanth story has nothing to do with its family tree and everything to do with something as basic as its own lifespan. Starting in the 1970s, researchers estimated Coelacanth age the same way a forester might age a tree, by counting growth rings preserved on its scales, and concluded the fish lived a maximum of about 20 years, placing it among the fastest maturing large fish in the entire ocean. That number never sat comfortably alongside everything else already known about the species. Coelacanths have an unusually slow metabolism, low oxygen requirements, and give birth to live young rather than laying eggs, traits typically found together in animals built for slow, long lifespans, not short, fast ones, a contradiction researchers noted for decades without resolving it. In 2021, a research team led by Kelly Mahe re-examined Coelacanth scales using polarized light microscopy, a technique sensitive enough to reveal much finer growth marks than the equipment available to researchers back in the 1970s, examining specimens ranging from newly collected embryos all the way up to an 84-year-old adult held in a museum collection. The growth rings counted decades earlier turned out to be the wrong rings entirely, a coarser, more visible set of markings that weren't actually annual at all. The true annual rings, 5 times more numerous than anyone had been counting for the previous 50 years, told a completely different story. Coelacanths can live to nearly 100 years old, don't reach reproductive maturity until somewhere between 40 and 69 years of age, depending on sex, and carry their young for roughly 5 years before giving birth, one of the longest gestation periods ever documented in any vertebrate on Earth. A species already famous for outliving its own declared extinction had also, it turned out, been quietly outliving every published estimate of its actual lifespan for half a century, hiding inside growth rings too fine for anyone to properly resolve until the right kind of light finally came along. The correction mattered for more than just curiosity. A species this slow to mature and this slow to reproduce is also far more vulnerable to overfishing and accidental bycatch than a 20-year lifespan would ever suggest, since losing even a small number of adults old enough to actually breed can set an already critically endangered population back for decades. A risk conservation researchers say they now understand far better than they did before Mahe's team corrected the record. Line up everything the Coelacanth's rediscovery has actually revealed, and the story looks nothing like a single dramatic moment on a South African dock in 1938. That moment, as significant as it was, turned out to be only the beginning of a much longer, ongoing correction that has continued for nearly a century since. The species assumed extinct for 66 million years turned out to be alive, in not one location but two, separated by an entire ocean and discovered nearly 60 years apart, both times by complete accident rather than deliberate search, first on a fishing trawler and later in a market stall selling it as dinner. Its reputation as the evolutionary bridge to land animals, the entire reason paleontologists treated it as scientifically important in the first place, didn't survive contact with its own genome, handed instead to a different, far less famous fish most people have never even heard of, despite its far stronger claim to the title. And the lifespan researchers confidently published and repeated in textbooks for 50 straight years turned out to be off by a factor of 5, sitting the entire time inside growth rings too fine to see until someone finally used the right kind of light to look closely enough. A fish declared gone at the exact same moment as the dinosaurs has spent the better part of a century proving that single declaration wrong, one correction at a time, each one starting the same way the very first one did back in 1938, with someone finally looking closely enough to notice what didn't match. Whether that someone was a museum curator on a South African dock, a honeymooning biologist at an Indonesian fish market, or a geneticist reading a genome nobody had thought to fully question before.